The morning sun cast long shadows across the busy downtown street as people hurried past the figure sitting quietly against the brick wall of the old bank building. Marcus Thompson had been in this same spot for 3 months now, watching the world rush by without really seeing him. His weathered face told stories that most people were too busy to read, and his worn military jacket hung loosely on his thin frame. At 52 years old, Marcus had served his country for 23 years in the United States Army. He had been deployed to Iraq twice and Afghanistan once, earning several medals, including a Bronze Star for his brave actions during a dangerous mission to rescue fellow soldiers. But none of that seemed to matter now as he sat on the cold concrete with his small cardboard sign that simply read, "Veteran. Any help appreciated." The transformation from decorated soldier to homeless veteran had not happened overnight. After returning from his final deployment in Afghanistan, Marcus struggled with what doctors called post-traumatic stress disorder. The nightmares came every night, filled with explosions and the faces of friends he had lost. Simple sounds like car backfires or loud music would make him jump and sweat. Sleep became his enemy, and he found himself drinking more and more just to quiet the memories that haunted him. His wife Sarah had tried to help at first. She would hold him when the nightmares woke him up screaming, and she encouraged him to see the counselors at the Veterans Affairs Hospital. But as months turned into years, the strain became too much. Marcus could see the fear in her eyes when he would suddenly become angry over small things, and he hated himself for it. The man who had once been her loving husband was becoming someone she no longer recognized. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening in October. Marcus had been drinking since noon, trying to wash away the memories of an ambush that had killed 3 of his squad members. When Sarah asked him to please get help, something inside him snapped. He threw a glass against the wall, shouting words he would later regret. The look of terror on his wife's face sobered him instantly, but the damage was done. That night, Marcus packed his few belongings into an old duffel bag and left the house. He could not bear the thought of hurting the woman he loved, even though leaving her was like tearing his heart in half. Sarah begged him to stay, promising they could work things out together, but Marcus was convinced that everyone would be better off without him. The first few weeks of homelessness were the hardest. Marcus slept in his old pickup truck until it broke down, and he could not afford to fix it. Then, he found himself sleeping in parks, under bridges, and in doorways of closed shops. The weather was getting colder, and he had to learn quickly how to survive on the streets. Other homeless people taught him where to find food and safe places to sleep. There was Jimmy, an older man who had been living on the streets for 10 years, who showed Marcus which restaurants threw away good food at the end of the day. There was Maria, a woman in her 40s who had lost her job and apartment after getting sick, who taught him which shelters were safe and which ones to avoid. But even among the homeless community, Marcus felt different. Many of them had mental illness or addiction problems that had led them to the streets. Marcus knew his drinking was a problem, but he felt like his situation was temporary. He kept telling himself that he just needed to get back on his feet, find a job, and everything would be okay again. Finding work proved much harder than Marcus had expected. His military skills seemed useless in the civilian world. Employers would look at the gap in his work history and the address of the shelter on his application, and their enthusiasm would fade quickly. Even when he managed to get interviews, his appearance worked against him. His clothes were worn and sometimes dirty, and he could not always afford to shower regularly. The rejection letters piled up, and Marcus began to lose hope. He started drinking more heavily, spending what little money he could scrape together on cheap alcohol instead of food. His pride, which had once been his strength as a soldier, now became his weakness. He refused to ask for help from veteran organizations, convinced that he should be able to handle his problems alone. As winter approached, Marcus found himself spending more time on the corner by the bank building. People would sometimes drop coins into the small cup beside him, but most walked by without even looking in his direction. He became invisible, just another piece of the urban landscape that busy people learned to ignore. The irony was not lost on him. In the military, he had been respected and valued. His opinion mattered, and people looked up to him as a leader. Now, he was just a problem to be avoided, a reminder of society's failures that made people uncomfortable. The same people who put yellow ribbon stickers on their cars to support the troops would cross the street to avoid walking past him. During the long hours sitting on the sidewalk, Marcus would watch the endless stream of people and wonder about their lives. The businessman in the expensive suit who checked his phone every 30 seconds. The young mother pushing a stroller while talking rapidly to someone on her phone. The teenagers laughing and joking as they walked to school. All of them had purpose and direction, things that Marcus felt he had lost completely. Sometimes children would stare at him with curious eyes until their parents hurried them along. Marcus remembered being a child himself, growing up in a small town in Ohio where everyone knew everyone else. His father had been a factory worker, and his mother had stayed home to raise Marcus and his two sisters. They had not had much money, but they had been happy and felt secure in their community. The decision to join the army had seemed natural to Marcus. He wanted to serve his country and see the world beyond his small hometown. The military had given him structure and purpose, and he had thrived in the disciplined environment. Rising through the ranks had taken years of hard work and dedication, but Marcus had loved every minute of it. His first deployment to Iraq had been eye-opening. The heat, the dust, and the constant danger were unlike anything he had experienced in training. But Marcus had adapted quickly, and his natural leadership abilities had made him popular with the younger soldiers in his unit. He had written letters to Sarah almost every day, describing the people he met and the places he saw, always ending with promises to come home safely. The second deployment had been harder. More soldiers were dying, and the enemy seemed to be everywhere. Marcus had seen friends killed by roadside bombs and sniper fire. He had held dying soldiers in his arms and tried to comfort them in their final moments. But he had pushed through, focusing on his duty and his responsibility to his men. Afghanistan had been the worst of all. The mountainous terrain made every mission dangerous, and the enemy knew the land better than the American forces. It was there that Marcus had earned his Bronze Star, leading a rescue mission to save 3 soldiers who had been captured during a patrol. The mission had been successful, but 2 of Marcus's squad members had been killed in the fighting. Now, sitting on the cold sidewalk with his back against the brick wall, Marcus often thought about those fallen soldiers. They had died serving their country, and their families could be proud of their sacrifice. But what did his own sacrifice mean? He had given 23 years of his life to the military, had risked his life countless times, and had watched friends die. And for what? To end up forgotten and ignored on a city street? The bitterness was eating away at Marcus like a cancer. Every day brought new humiliations and disappointments. The looks of disgust from people who assumed he was just another lazy drunk looking for handouts. The police officers who moved him along when business owners complained about his presence. The social workers who talked to him like he was a child who could not understand their complicated forms and procedures. But perhaps the worst part was the complete loss of dignity. Marcus had once been a man that others looked up to and respected. He had made important decisions that affected the lives of his soldiers. He had been trusted with classified information and expensive equipment. Now, he had to beg for spare change just to buy a cup of coffee or a cheap meal. As autumn turned to winter, the nights became increasingly difficult. The shelter had a waiting list, and Marcus often found himself sleeping in doorways or under bridges. The cold seemed to seep into his bones, and he would wake up stiff and aching. His cough grew worse, and he suspected he was getting sick, but medical care was another luxury he could not afford. One particularly cold November morning, as Marcus sat shivering against the bank wall, a well-dressed woman stopped in front of him. She was probably in her 30s, with kind eyes and a gentle smile. Instead of just dropping coins and hurrying away like most people did, she knelt down beside him. "Good morning," she said softly. "My name is Jennifer. What's yours?" Marcus was so surprised by the question that it took him a moment to respond. Most people did not want to know his name. They preferred to keep him anonymous, just a generic homeless person who made them feel guilty for a moment before they forgot about him completely. "Marcus," he said quietly, his voice hoarse from the cold and lack of use. "It's nice to meet you, Marcus," Jennifer said, and she sounded like she really meant it. "I work at the legal aid office down the street, and I see you here every day. I was wondering if you might like to get some coffee and maybe talk for a few minutes." The simple act of kindness nearly brought tears to Marcus's eyes. It had been so long since anyone had treated him like a human being worth talking to. He nodded, not trusting his voice to answer, and slowly stood up on stiff legs. The coffee shop was warm and bright, and Marcus felt self-conscious about his appearance as Jennifer led him to a corner table. But she chatted easily about the weather and the busy downtown area, putting him at ease. When their coffee arrived, she asked gentle questions about his background, listening carefully to his answers without judgment. For the first time in months, Marcus found himself talking about his military service. Jennifer seemed genuinely interested in his stories, asking thoughtful questions about his experiences and thanking him for his service. It felt good to remember the man he had once been, before the drinking and the homelessness had stripped away his sense of self-worth. But even as Marcus enjoyed the conversation and the warm coffee, he could not shake the feeling that this was just temporary kindness. Soon Jennifer would have to return to her important job and her comfortable life, and he would be back on the street corner, invisible once again. As if reading his thoughts, Jennifer reached into her purse and pulled out a business card. "Marcus, I want you to know that there are people who care about veterans like yourself. I have some contacts at organizations that specifically help former military personnel who are struggling. Would you be willing to let me make some calls?" Marcus took the card, running his thumb over the raised letters. It was such a small thing, but it represented something he had almost given up on completely: hope. Maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance for him to reclaim his life and his dignity. Looking across the table at Jennifer's encouraging smile, Marcus made a decision. He had been hiding from help for too long, too proud to admit that he needed assistance. But sitting in that warm coffee shop, being treated like a person rather than a problem, he realized that accepting help was not giving up. It was the first step toward fighting back. "Yes," he said firmly, meeting Jennifer's eyes for the first time. "I think I'd like that very much." That afternoon, as Marcus returned to his spot against the bank wall, something had changed inside him. The hopelessness was still there, but it was mixed now with something else. For the first time in months, he began to believe that maybe his story was not over yet. Maybe there were still people who remembered that homeless veterans were heroes who had simply lost their way. The busy street looked the same as it had that morning, with people hurrying past focused on their own lives. But Marcus felt different. He sat up straighter, and when people dropped coins into his cup, he made sure to thank them and make eye contact. He was still homeless, still struggling, but he was no longer invisible to himself. As the sun began to set, Marcus pulled out Jennifer's business card and read it again. Tomorrow, he would call the number she had written on the back. Tomorrow, he would take the first step toward reclaiming his life. Tonight, though, he would remember that he was Sergeant Marcus Thompson, Bronze Star recipient, decorated veteran of the United States Army. And, for the first time in a very long time, that felt like enough to keep him going. The next morning arrived with a crisp December wind that cut through Marcus's thin jacket like a knife. He had spent the night in the doorway of a closed shop, huddled under newspapers and a torn blanket someone had left behind. His body ached from sleeping on concrete, but his mind felt clearer than it had in months. Jennifer's business card was still in his pocket, slightly wrinkled from being handled so many times. Marcus had memorized the phone number, but calling still felt like jumping off a cliff into the unknown. What if they could not help him? What if they judged him for letting his life fall apart so completely? What if this was just another dead end in a series of disappointments? But as Marcus watched the morning commuters hurry past him, clutching their coffee cups and checking their phones, he realized he had nothing left to lose. He had already hit rock bottom. The only direction left was up, and that meant swallowing his pride and asking for help. The public library opened at 9 o'clock, and Marcus was waiting outside when the librarian unlocked the doors. The warm building smelled like books and cleaning supplies, a comforting smell that reminded him of studying for his high school diploma during quiet evenings in Ohio. The librarian, a middle-aged woman with gray hair and kind eyes, nodded at him without judgment as he made his way to the bank of computers near the back. Making the phone call took Marcus 3 attempts. The first time, he hung up before anyone answered, his heart pounding with anxiety. The second time, he got an answering machine and could not find the words to leave a message. But on the third try, A woman answered with a warm, professional voice. Veterans Support Network, this is Carol speaking. How can I help you today? Marcus's throat felt dry, but he forced himself to speak. My name is Marcus Thompson. I'm a veteran, and I'm having some problems. A woman named Jennifer gave me this number and said you might be able to help. Of course, Marcus. Jennifer Davidson from the Legal Aid Office? She's wonderful. I'm so glad she connected you with us. Can you tell me a little bit about your situation? The conversation that followed was unlike anything Marcus had experienced since becoming homeless. Carol listened without interrupting as he stumbled through his story, explaining about his military service, his struggles with PTSD, the breakdown of his marriage, and his current living situation. She asked gentle questions that helped him fill in important details, and she never once made him feel ashamed or judged. Marcus, what you're going through is more common than you might think, Carol said when he finished. We work with veterans every day who are facing similar challenges. The important thing is that you've taken the first step by reaching out. Are you available to come in this afternoon? I'd like to introduce you to one of our counselors who specializes in helping veterans transition back into stable housing and employment. The Veterans Support Network office was located in a converted house about 2 miles from downtown. Marcus walked the entire distance, partly to save the bus fare and partly because he needed the time to prepare himself mentally. The building looked welcoming rather than institutional, with a small garden in front and a sign by the door that simply read, "Welcome Home." Inside, the walls were decorated with photos of veterans from different eras and conflicts. Marcus found himself stopping in front of a picture of soldiers in Iraq, remembering his own deployments and the brotherhood he had felt with his fellow service members. Those bonds had been stronger than family ties, forged in the crucible of shared danger and mutual dependence. Carol turned out to be a woman in her 50s with short blonde hair and laugh lines around her eyes. She had the bearing of someone who had served in the military herself, and Marcus later learned that she had been a Navy nurse for 12 years before transitioning to social work. Her office was comfortable and informal, with 2 chairs facing each other rather than the traditional desk setup that made conversations feel like interrogations. The first thing I want you to know, Marcus, is that you're not alone in this, Carol said as they settled into their chairs. We see about 50 new veterans every month, and many of them have stories very similar to yours. PTSD is a real injury, just like a broken leg or a bullet wound. It's not a sign of weakness, and it's definitely treatable. Over the next hour, Carol explained the various services available through their organization. There was counseling specifically designed for combat veterans, support groups where former soldiers could share their experiences with others who understood, and practical assistance with housing, employment, and benefits applications. They could also help Marcus reconnect with his family if that was something he wanted to pursue. The process isn't always easy, Carol warned him honestly. Recovery takes time, and there will be setbacks along the way. But we've helped hundreds of veterans rebuild their lives, and I believe we can help you too. The question is, are you ready to do the work? Marcus thought about the question seriously. Was he ready to stop running from his problems and start facing them? Was he ready to admit that he could not handle everything by himself? Was he ready to trust people again after feeling let down by the system that had promised to take care of veterans? Looking around the office at the certificates on the wall and the photos of smiling veterans who had successfully completed the program, Marcus made his decision. Yes, he said firmly. I'm ready. The first few weeks of working with the Veterans Support Network were both hopeful and frustrating. Marcus began attending individual counseling sessions twice a week with Dr. Patricia Williams, a psychologist who specialized in trauma therapy. Dr. Williams was a small woman with an enormous presence, and she had a way of cutting through Marcus's defensive walls with gentle but persistent questions. The therapy sessions were difficult. Dr. Williams encouraged Marcus to talk about his experiences in combat, the friends he had lost, and the guilt he carried for surviving when others had not. She helped him understand that his drinking was not a moral failing, but a way of self-medicating the pain and anxiety that came with PTSD. Your brain learned to be hypervigilant in a war zone because that's what kept you alive, she explained during one session. Now that you're back home, your brain is still stuck in survival mode. We need to help it learn that you're safe now. In addition to individual therapy, Marcus started attending a support group that met every Thursday evening. The group consisted of 8 veterans from various conflicts, ranging in age from 25 to 63. At first, Marcus felt uncomfortable sharing personal details with strangers, but gradually he began to open up as he listened to their stories. There was Robert, a young Marine who had lost his leg to an IED in Afghanistan and struggled with phantom pain and depression. There was Susan, one of the first women to serve in combat roles during the Gulf War, who had been dealing with PTSD for over 20 years. There was David, a Vietnam veteran who had only recently sought help after decades of alcohol abuse and failed relationships. What struck Marcus most about the group was how normal they all seemed when they were not talking about their military experiences. They joked around before the session started, shared photos of their families, and complained about mundane things like traffic and the weather. These were not broken people. They were wounded warriors who were learning to heal. The group sessions helped Marcus realize that his feelings of guilt, anger, and loss were shared by many veterans. The nightmares that had tormented him for years were a common symptom of PTSD. The hypervigilance that made him jump at sudden noises was a normal response to trauma. Most importantly, the shame he felt about becoming homeless was misplaced. Many successful, intelligent, decorated veterans had struggled with the transition to civilian life. While Marcus was working on his mental health, Carol was helping him navigate the practical aspects of rebuilding his life. She assisted him with applying for disability benefits through the VA, a process that was so complex and bureaucratic that Marcus would never have been able to complete it on his own. She also helped him get enrolled in a job training program specifically designed for veterans. The most immediate need was housing. Marcus had been sleeping in shelters and doorways for months, and winter was getting worse. Carol connected him with a transitional housing program that provided small apartments for homeless veterans while they worked on getting back on their feet. The apartment was tiny and sparsely furnished, but it had a bed, a bathroom, and a door that locked. For Marcus, it felt like luxury. Having a stable place to sleep made everything else easier. Marcus could shower regularly, wash his clothes, and store his few possessions safely. He had an address to put on job applications, and he could schedule interviews without worrying about where he would spend the night. Most importantly, he could begin to think beyond mere survival and start planning for the future. The job training program was designed to help veterans translate their military skills into civilian careers. Marcus discovered that his experience leading soldiers and managing complex logistics operations was highly valued by employers, once he learned how to present those skills in civilian terms. The program also helped him update his resume, practice interviewing skills, and network with veteran-friendly employers. One of the most challenging aspects of the program was learning to talk about himself positively again. Marcus had spent so many months feeling worthless and forgotten that it was difficult to remember his accomplishments and strengths. The program facilitators worked with him to identify his core competencies and develop confidence in his abilities. You managed the logistics for a forward operating base in Afghanistan, one facilitator reminded him during a mock interview. That means you were responsible for ensuring that thousands of soldiers had everything they needed to complete their missions safely. How is that not relevant to a civilian management position? Gradually, Marcus began to see himself through new eyes. Yes, he had made mistakes and faced serious challenges, but he had also demonstrated courage, leadership, and resilience throughout his military career. Those qualities had not disappeared just because he had struggled with PTSD and homelessness. The breakthrough came during his 4th week in the transitional housing program. Marcus was walking back to his apartment after a support group meeting when he heard shouting from the alley behind his building. Peering around the corner, he saw 3 teenagers surrounding an elderly man who had apparently been walking his small dog. One of the teenagers was demanding money while the other 2 blocked the man's escape routes. Without thinking, Marcus stepped into the alley and spoke in the commanding voice he had used with soldiers under his command. "That's enough. Leave him alone and move along." The teenagers turned toward Marcus, sizing him up. He was not a large man, and his civilian clothes did not make him look particularly intimidating. But there was something in his posture and tone of voice that suggested they would be wise not to test him. "Mind your own business, old man," one of them said. But There was less confidence in his voice than before. "This is my business," Marcus replied calmly. "You have 5 seconds to walk away before I call the police." The teenagers looked at each other uncertainly. They had expected to intimidate an elderly victim, not deal with someone who clearly was not afraid of confrontation. After a moment of tense silence, they decided the situation was not worth the risk and walked away, muttering threats and complaints. The elderly man was shaking as Marcus helped him to his feet. His small terrier was barking excitedly, tugging at its leash. "Thank you so much," the man said. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come along." "Are you hurt?" Marcus asked, checking to make sure the man was not injured. "No, I'm fine. Just scared. They wanted my wallet, but I don't carry much cash." The man looked at Marcus with curiosity. "You handled that very well. Are you a police officer?" "No," Marcus said with a slight smile. "I'm a soldier. Well, I was a soldier. Now I guess I'm just someone who doesn't like bullies." As they walked together toward the street, the elderly man introduced himself as George Peterson. He was 78 years old, a retired teacher who lived alone since his wife had passed away 2 years earlier. The small dog, a Jack Russell Terrier named Buddy, was his constant companion. "I walk Buddy every evening around this time," George explained. "I've never had any trouble before, but I guess the neighborhood is changing." Marcus found himself liking George immediately. There was something familiar about the older man's dignity and quiet strength that reminded Marcus of his own father. They talked for a few more minutes before parting ways, but Marcus felt energized by the encounter. For the first time in months, he had been able to help someone else instead of being the one who needed help. The incident stayed with Marcus over the following days. He realized that intervening in the alley had felt natural and right in a way that nothing had felt since he left the military. Using his training and experience to protect someone weaker had reminded him of why he had joined the army in the first place. Dr. Williams was interested in Marcus's reaction to the incident during their next therapy session. "How did it feel to be the helper instead of the person being helped?" she asked. Marcus considered the question carefully. "It felt like myself again," he said finally. "Like the person I used to be before everything fell apart." "That person never went away," Dr. Williams pointed out. "He was just buried under a lot of pain and trauma. As you heal, more of him is going to emerge." The conversation with Dr. Williams helped Marcus understand something important about his recovery process. He had been so focused on getting his life back to where it had been before his PTSD symptoms began that he had forgotten about moving forward. Recovery was not about returning to an earlier version of himself. It was about becoming a new and better version that incorporated both his strengths and his struggles. This realization coincided with positive developments in other areas of his life. The disability benefits application had been approved, providing Marcus with a modest but steady monthly income. The job training program had connected him with several potential employers, and he had been invited for interviews at 2 different companies. More importantly, Marcus had been sober for 6 weeks. The combination of therapy, medication, and stable housing had reduced his anxiety to manageable levels, and he no longer felt the need to drink every day just to cope. The support group had helped him develop healthier strategies for dealing with stress and difficult emotions. One evening after his support group meeting, Marcus decided to take a longer route home through the downtown area where he had spent so many months sitting on the sidewalk. As he walked past the old bank building where he used to panhandle, he saw another homeless veteran in the same spot. The man was younger, maybe in his early 30s, and wore a Marine Corps jacket that had seen better days. Marcus approached slowly, not wanting to startle the man. "Evening," he said quietly, sitting down on the sidewalk a few feet away. The younger man looked up suspiciously. "Yeah, what do you want?" "Nothing," Marcus said. "I used to sit in this exact same spot not too long ago. Just thought you might want some company." The Marine's expression softened slightly. "You're a vet." "Army, 23 years. You." "Marines, 2 tours in Iraq." The man held out his hand. "Name's Jake." Marcus shook it firmly. "Marcus, pleasure to meet you, Jake." They talked for over an hour, sharing stories about their service and their struggles with civilian life. Marcus listened without judgment as Jake described his own battles with PTSD, unemployment, and family problems. The young Marine's story was depressingly familiar, but Marcus found himself thinking about solutions rather than dwelling on the problems. Before leaving, Marcus gave Jake one of Carol's business cards. These people helped me get back on my feet, he said. They're good people who actually understand what we've been through. Give them a call when you're ready. Jake took the card but looked skeptical. I've tried getting help before. It never works out. I know, Marcus said. I felt the same way. But sometimes you have to try a few times before it sticks. The important thing is not giving up on yourself. Walking back to his apartment that night, Marcus felt a sense of purpose that had been missing from his life for a long time. Maybe his experience on the streets had not been completely meaningless if it could help him relate to other struggling veterans. Maybe there was a way to turn his pain into something useful for others who were walking the same difficult path. The thought stayed with him as he prepared for bed in his small but comfortable apartment. Tomorrow he had a job interview at a logistics company that worked with military contractors. Next week, he had an appointment to look at a larger apartment in a better neighborhood. His life was finally moving forward again, one small step at a time. But tonight, as he lay in his own bed for the first time in months, Marcus thought about Jake sitting alone on the cold sidewalk and all the other homeless veterans scattered throughout the city. His recovery was just the beginning. There was still work to be done. Spring arrived early that year, bringing with it a sense of renewal that Marcus could feel in every aspect of his life. The job interview at Continental Logistics had gone better than he had dared to hope, and he was now 3 months into his position as a warehouse supervisor. The work was challenging but familiar, drawing on the organizational and leadership skills he had developed during his military career. Marcus's supervisor, Tom Bradley, was a former Air Force sergeant who understood the value of hiring veterans. You guys know how to get things done, Tom had told Marcus during his first week. You understand deadlines, you can work under pressure, and you know how to lead a team. That's exactly what we need here. The warehouse employed about 30 people, including several other veterans who had found their way to the company through word of mouth and veteran job placement programs. Marcus quickly discovered that his experience managing supply chains in combat zones translated perfectly to civilian logistics operations. Within 2 months, he had implemented several efficiency improvements that impressed the company's senior management. More importantly, Marcus was beginning to feel like himself again. The combination of stable employment, ongoing therapy, and consistent sobriety had restored much of his confidence and sense of purpose. He had moved into a larger one-bedroom apartment in a quiet neighborhood, and for the first time in years, he was able to save money and plan for the future. The relationship with his ex-wife, Sarah, remained complicated. They had spoken on the phone a few times after Carol had helped Marcus reconnect with his family. Sarah had been relieved to hear that he was getting help and doing better, but years of pain and disappointment could not be easily overcome. They were taking things slowly, meeting occasionally for coffee and talking through the issues that had driven them apart. I want to forgive you, Marcus, Sarah had told him during one of their meetings. But I need to know that you're really committed to staying sober and dealing with your problems. I can't go through losing you again. Marcus understood her caution. He had broken too many promises during the worst period of his drinking and PTSD symptoms. Trust would have to be rebuilt slowly, through consistent actions rather than words. But having the possibility of reconciliation gave him additional motivation to continue working on his recovery. Dr. Williams was pleased with Marcus's progress, but cautioned him about becoming overconfident. Recovery is not a straight line, she reminded him during one of their sessions. There will be setbacks and difficult days. The important thing is to have support systems in place and to remember the tools you've learned for managing stress and triggers. The support group remained an important part of Marcus's weekly routine. Several of the original members had moved on to different stages of their recovery, but new veterans joined regularly. Marcus found himself taking on more of a mentoring role, sharing his experiences with newer group members who were just beginning their journey toward stability. One Thursday evening, a new veteran joined the group. Marcus recognized him immediately as Jake, the young Marine he had met on the street corner several months earlier. Jake looked better than he had during their previous encounter. He was clean, his clothes were neat, and he had gained some weight. But his eyes still held the haunted look that Marcus remembered from his own early days of recovery. After the group session ended, Marcus approached Jake with a smile. "Good to see you again," he said, offering his hand. "I'm glad you decided to give this place a try." Jake shook his hand, but seemed embarrassed. "Yeah, well, It took me a while to work up the courage to call. I wasn't sure they'd want to help someone like me. Someone like you? Marcus asked. You mean a Marine who served his country and ended up in a tough spot? Jake, half the guys in this room have been exactly where you are. The other half wish they had asked for help as early as you did. Over the following weeks, Marcus watched Jake begin the same difficult process of recovery that he had experienced. It was not easy. Jake struggled with anger management issues and had several relapses with alcohol. But he kept coming back to group meetings, and he gradually began to trust the counselors and case workers who were trying to help him. Marcus found himself thinking more and more about the other veterans who were still living on the streets, unaware of the resources available to them or too proud to ask for help. During his lunch breaks at work, he would sometimes walk through the downtown area where he had spent so many months. He would see familiar faces and new ones, all wearing the same expression of defeat and desperation that he remembered from his own time on the streets. The idea came to him gradually, crystallizing during a conversation with Carol about the challenges of reaching homeless veterans. The problem is that many of them don't trust the system, Carol explained. They've been let down before, either by the VA or by other agencies that promised help but didn't deliver. They're suspicious of anyone in a uniform or an official capacity. But they might trust another veteran, Marcus suggested. Someone who's been where they are and understands what they're going through. Carol's eyes lit up with interest. That's actually a brilliant idea. We've talked about developing a peer outreach program, but we haven't had the right person to lead it. Would you be interested in something like that? The concept of peer outreach made perfect sense to Marcus. Veterans who were living on the streets would be more likely to listen to someone who had walked in their shoes rather than a social worker or government official. A fellow veteran could speak their language, understand their fears and resistance, and provide living proof that recovery was possible. Marcus began volunteering with the Veteran Support Network on weekends, working with Carol to develop a formal outreach program. They created information packets about available services, trained Marcus in basic counseling techniques, and established protocols for safely approaching homeless veterans on the streets. The first few outreach attempts were challenging. Many of the homeless veterans Marcus approached were suspicious of his motives or convinced that help was not really available to them. Some were too intoxicated or mentally ill to engage in meaningful conversation. Others had been disappointed so many times that they had given up hope entirely. But, gradually, Marcus began to make connections. He would sit with veterans on park benches and under bridges, sharing his own story and listening to theirs. He learned that each person had a unique path to homelessness, but the underlying themes were depressingly familiar. PTSD, substance abuse, family breakdown, unemployment, and loss of dignity. There was Frank, a Vietnam veteran who had been living in a tent under a highway overpass for 3 years. Frank had never applied for disability benefits because he distrusted the government and believed that accepting help would make him weak. There was Melissa, one of the few female combat veterans Marcus encountered on the streets. She had been sexually assaulted by a fellow soldier and developed severe PTSD that made it difficult for her to trust anyone. Each veteran required a different approach and different resources. Marcus learned to be patient, sometimes visiting the same person multiple times before they were willing to accept help. He celebrated small victories, like convincing someone to visit a doctor or apply for food stamps, while working toward larger goals like stable housing and employment. The work was emotionally demanding, but deeply rewarding. Marcus felt like he was finally using his military training for its intended purpose, helping his fellow soldiers. The leadership skills he had developed as a sergeant were perfectly suited to this new mission of guiding lost veterans back to stability and dignity. One particularly memorable case involved an older veteran named Robert who had been living in an abandoned warehouse for over a year. Robert was a former Army medic who had served in Vietnam and struggled with alcoholism for decades. When Marcus first met him, Robert was severely malnourished and showing signs of serious health problems. It took weeks of regular visits before Robert trusted Marcus enough to accept medical help. Marcus would bring food and clean water, sitting with Robert for hours while he shared stories about his service in Vietnam. Robert had seen terrible things during the war and had never received proper treatment for his trauma. "Nobody cared about us when we came back," Robert told Marcus during one of their conversations. People spit on us and called us baby killers. I figured if nobody wanted us then, why would they want us now? Marcus helped Robert understand that attitudes toward veterans had changed significantly since Vietnam. He arranged for Robert to receive medical care and connected him with age-appropriate housing services. Most importantly, he convinced Robert that he deserved help and respect for his service, regardless of the mistakes he had made since returning from the war. The success stories began to accumulate. Jake completed the job training program and found work at a construction company. Frank finally applied for disability benefits and moved into subsidized housing. Melissa entered an intensive therapy program specifically designed for female veterans with trauma histories. Each success reinforced Marcus's belief in the importance of the outreach work. But the most significant development came 6 months into the outreach program, when Marcus received a phone call that would change everything. The caller identified himself as Colonel James Mitchell from the local Army Reserve Unit, and he had heard about Marcus's work with homeless veterans through the military grapevine. Sergeant Thompson, the colonel said, using Marcus's former rank, "I'd like to invite you to speak at our unit's annual Veterans Appreciation Ceremony. We're honoring local veterans who have made significant contributions to their communities, and your outreach work definitely qualifies." Marcus was flattered but nervous about speaking to a large group of active duty soldiers. "Sir, I'm honored by the invitation, but I'm not sure I'm the right person for something like that. My story isn't exactly inspiring. I was homeless myself not too long ago." "Sergeant, that's exactly why you're the right person," Colonel Mitchell replied firmly. "Our soldiers need to understand that struggling with PTSD or other service-related issues doesn't make them failures. They need to see that recovery is possible and that asking for help is a sign of strength, not weakness." The Veterans Appreciation Ceremony was held at the local National Guard Armory on a Saturday evening in late spring. Marcus arrived early, wearing his old dress uniform that he had retrieved from storage and had professionally cleaned. It still fit, though it felt strange after so many months of civilian clothes. The armory was filled with active duty soldiers, veterans from various conflicts, and family members. Marcus recognized several faces from his outreach work, including Jake, who had come to show support. He also spotted Jennifer, the legal aid lawyer who had first convinced him to seek help, and Carol from the Veterans Support Network. When his turn came to speak, Marcus approached the podium with his prepared remarks in hand. But as he looked out at the assembled crowd, he decided to set aside his notes and speak from the heart. "2 years ago, I was sitting on a sidewalk downtown with a cardboard sign, asking for spare change," he began. "I was a 23-year Army veteran with a Bronze Star and multiple commendations, but none of that seemed to matter anymore. I had lost everything that was important to me: my family, my home, my dignity, and my sense of purpose." The room was completely silent as Marcus continued his story, describing his struggles with PTSD, his descent into homelessness, and his eventual recovery with the help of the Veterans Support Network. He talked about the importance of asking for help and the danger of trying to handle everything alone. "The strongest thing I ever did as a soldier was not leading that rescue mission in Afghanistan," Marcus said, his voice growing stronger as he spoke. "It was walking into that Veterans Center and admitting that I needed help. That took more courage than anything I ever did in combat." Marcus went on to describe his outreach work and the veterans he had helped connect with services. He emphasized that every soldier in the room was valuable and deserving of support, regardless of what challenges they might face after their service ended. "We take care of our own," he concluded. "That's not just something we say in the military. It's a sacred obligation, and it doesn't end when we take off the uniform. If anything, it becomes more important, because that's when many of us face our greatest battles." The standing ovation that followed was unexpected and overwhelming. As Marcus stepped down from the podium, he was surrounded by active duty soldiers and veterans who wanted to thank him for his words and share their own experiences. Several young soldiers told him that they had been struggling with anxiety and depression, but had been afraid to seek help for fear of damaging their careers. But the most meaningful moment came when an older man in a general's uniform approached Marcus near the end of the evening. The man was tall and distinguished, with silver hair and the bearing of someone who had spent decades in positions of high responsibility. "Sergeant Thompson, the general said, extending his hand. I'm General Patricia Henderson, Commanding General of the Regional Medical Command. I wanted to personally thank you for your service, both in uniform and out of it. Marcus shook the general's hand, feeling somewhat overwhelmed by the attention from such a high-ranking officer. Thank you, ma'am. It's an honor to meet you. The honor is mine, General Henderson replied. What you're doing with homeless veterans is exactly the kind of leadership our Army values represent. You're living proof that service to others doesn't end with retirement. The conversation with General Henderson continued for several minutes, during which she asked detailed questions about Marcus's outreach work and the challenges facing homeless veterans. She was particularly interested in the peer support model and its effectiveness compared to traditional social services. I'd like to stay in touch with you, Sergeant, the general said before leaving. I think there might be opportunities to expand this kind of program to other communities. The Army has a vested interest in taking care of its veterans, and you've developed something that really works. As the evening wound down, Marcus found himself surrounded by the people who had supported him through his recovery. Sarah had come to the ceremony, and she stood beside him with tears in her eyes. I'm so proud of you, she whispered, taking his hand for the first time in over a year. Jake approached with a huge grin on his face. Thanks for not giving up on me, brother, he said, embracing Marcus in a brief but heartfelt hug. I wouldn't be here without you. Carol and Dr. Williams were there as well, both beaming with pride at how far their former client had come. You've turned your pain into purpose, Dr. Williams told him. That's the highest form of healing. As Marcus drove home that night, still wearing his dress uniform, he reflected on the incredible journey that had brought him to this moment. Just 2 years earlier, he had been convinced that his life was over and that he had nothing left to offer the world. Tonight, he had been honored by his peers and praised by a general for his contributions to the veteran community. But, more importantly, he had found his mission again. The outreach work gave him the same sense of purpose that he had felt as a squad leader in combat, protecting and caring for the soldiers under his command. The homeless veterans on the streets were his soldiers now, and he would not abandon them any more than he would have abandoned his troops in Afghanistan. The work was far from over. There were still too many veterans sleeping on cold streets, too many former heroes who had been forgotten by the society they had sworn to protect. But Marcus now knew that change was possible, one conversation and one connection at a time. As he pulled into his apartment complex, Marcus noticed that the parking lot was well lit and safe. His apartment was warm and comfortable, with food in the refrigerator and clean clothes in the closet. These simple things, which most people took for granted, still felt like luxuries to him. Tomorrow he would return to his job at the warehouse, where he was now being considered for a promotion to operations manager. Tomorrow evening, he would have dinner with Sarah, continuing their slow process of rebuilding their relationship. And, this weekend, he would be back on the streets, looking for veterans who needed to know that help was available and that they were not forgotten. The homeless veteran that everyone had overlooked was overlooked no more. He had found his way back from the darkness, and now he was helping to light the way for others who were still lost. The mission continued, and Marcus Thompson was exactly where he belonged, in service to his fellow soldiers, in service to his community, and in service to the values that had made him a soldier in the first place. The morning sun cast a golden glow over the small crowd gathered in the park near downtown, where Marcus had organized the city's first Veterans Resource Fair. Tables lined the walking paths, staffed by representatives from various organizations that provided services to former military personnel. The Veterans Support Network had a prominent display, along with the VA hospital, job training programs, housing assistance agencies, and mental health providers. Marcus walked between the tables, checking on volunteers, and greeting the veterans who had come seeking help. In the 18 months since the appreciation ceremony, his outreach program had grown from a one-man operation into a comprehensive network that served veterans throughout the metropolitan area. The success had attracted attention from government agencies, nonprofit organizations, and military commands across the region. The resource fair was the culmination of months of planning and coordination. Marcus had learned that many veterans were unaware of the services available to them, while service providers often struggled to connect with the veterans who needed help most. Bringing everyone together in a casual, non-threatening environment seemed like the logical solution. Marcus, this is incredible, said Jennifer, the legal aid lawyer who had first convinced him to seek help. She was now serving on the advisory board for the expanded outreach program. When I gave you my business card that morning, I never imagined it would lead to something like this. Marcus smiled as he watched Jake helping an elderly veteran fill out paperwork at one of the tables. Jake had become one of his most reliable volunteers, using his own recovery story to connect with veterans who were still struggling. None of us knew where it would lead, Marcus replied. But that's the thing about taking the first step. You can't see the whole staircase, but you have to start climbing anyway. The crowd was larger than Marcus had expected. In addition to homeless and struggling veterans, many active duty soldiers and recently discharged service members had come to learn about available resources. Families were there too, seeking help for loved ones who were having difficulty adjusting to civilian life. Near the information booth, Marcus noticed a commotion. A middle-aged woman was arguing with one of the volunteers, her voice rising in frustration. "I've been trying to get help for my son for 2 years," she was saying. "He came back from Iraq completely different, but nobody seems to care. He's been arrested 3 times, he can't keep a job, and now he's living in his car." Marcus approached the woman gently. "Ma'am, my name is Marcus Thompson. I help coordinate this event. Can you tell me about your son?" The woman, who introduced herself as Linda Martinez, was near tears as she described her son David's struggles since returning from deployment. David had been a model soldier, but had developed severe PTSD after witnessing several of his friends killed in an IED explosion. He had been prescribed medication by VA doctors, but stopped taking it because of side effects. His drinking had escalated, leading to problems with law enforcement and employment. "He won't listen to me anymore," Linda said. "He says I don't understand what he's been through, and he's right. But I'm watching him destroy his life, and I don't know how to help him." Marcus listened carefully to Linda's story, recognizing the familiar pattern of family members who felt helpless watching their loved ones spiral downward. "Where is David now?" he asked. "He's in his car in the parking lot," Linda admitted. "I begged him to come with me, but he refused. He says these things never help, that nobody really cares about veterans except when they need us to fight their wars." Marcus looked toward the parking lot, considering his options. He had learned that sometimes the most important outreach happened away from organized events, in moments of one-on-one connection between veterans who understood each other's experiences. "Would you mind if I went and talked to him?" Marcus asked. "Sometimes it helps to hear from someone who's been in a similar situation." Linda's eyes filled with hope. "Would you?" "Please, I'll try anything at this point." Marcus found David Martinez sitting in an older sedan with the windows down, smoking a cigarette and staring at nothing in particular. He was probably in his late 20s, with the lean build of an infantry soldier and the guarded expression that Marcus recognized from his own time on the streets. David looked up warily as Marcus approached the car. "David, my name is Marcus Thompson. I'm a veteran too, and your mother asked me to come talk to you." "Let me guess," David said with obvious bitterness. "You're here to tell me about all the wonderful programs that are going to fix my life. I've heard it all before. Actually, I was going to ask if you wanted to get some coffee and maybe talk about how much this whole thing sucks," Marcus replied, leaning against the car door. "Because in my experience, most of the people who want to help veterans have never actually been veterans themselves." David's expression shifted slightly, showing a flicker of interest. "You served?" 23 years, Army. 2 tours in Iraq, 1 in Afghanistan. Got out with a Bronze Star and a bad case of PTSD that I tried to drink away for a couple of years." Marcus paused, studying David's reaction. "Ended up homeless for about 8 months before I finally admitted I needed help." "You were homeless?" David asked, sitting up straighter in the driver's seat. "Lived on the streets downtown, panhandling for money to buy cheap wine. Lost my wife, my house, and my self-respect. Figured I was done for." Marcus gestured toward the park. "That was about 3 years ago. Now I run the outreach program that organized this whole event." David was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. "So what changed? What made the difference?" "Honestly, I got tired of feeling like shit every day, and I met some people who actually understood what I was going through instead of just pretending to understand." Marcus straightened up. "Look, I'm not going to try to sell you on anything. But if you want to grab that coffee and hear about what actually worked for me, I've got time. The coffee shop conversation lasted over 2 hours. David opened up slowly, describing his experiences in Iraq and the guilt he carried about surviving when his friends had not. He talked about the nightmares, the hypervigilance that made normal civilian life feel impossible, and the way alcohol temporarily quieted the chaos in his mind. Marcus shared his own story, including the darkest moments of his homelessness and the slow process of recovery that had brought him to where he was today. He was honest about the ongoing challenges, the setbacks, and the daily work required to maintain his sobriety and mental health. The thing that nobody tells you, Marcus explained, is that recovery isn't about going back to who you were before deployment. That person doesn't exist anymore. Recovery is about figuring out who you are now and building a life that works for this new version of yourself. When they returned to the park, David was willing to talk with some of the service providers. Marcus introduced him to Dr. Williams and stayed with him during the initial consultation. By the end of the day, David had enrolled in a PTSD treatment program and agreed to attend Marcus's support group. "I don't know if this will work," David told Marcus as they prepared to leave. "I've tried getting help before." "I know," Marcus replied. "I tried several times before it stuck too. But maybe this time will be different. And if it's not, we'll figure out what needs to change and try again." The resource fair was considered a huge success by all involved. Over 200 veterans had attended, and dozens had connected with services that could help them. But for Marcus, the most meaningful part was the individual connections like the one he had made with David Martinez. As the volunteers packed up the tables and displays, Marcus received a phone call that would change the direction of his work once again. The caller was Colonel Mitchell, the same officer who had invited him to speak at the Veterans Appreciation Ceremony nearly 2 years earlier. "Marcus, I have something I need to discuss with you," the colonel said. "Can you meet me at my office tomorrow? There's an opportunity one think you should consider." The next day, Marcus sat in Colonel Mitchell's office, listening to a proposal that seemed almost too good to be true. The Department of Veterans Affairs was launching a pilot program to establish peer outreach services in 10 cities across the country. They needed experienced veterans who could lead these programs and train other veterans in effective outreach techniques. The position would be a GS-13 federal civilian job, Colonel Mitchell explained. Good salary, excellent benefits, and the opportunity to expand what you've been doing here to a much larger scale. You'd be based here but would travel to other cities to establish new programs and train local coordinators. Marcus was stunned by the offer. It represented validation of his work at the highest levels of government, as well as financial security beyond anything he had imagined possible during his homeless days. But, more importantly, it would allow him to help veterans on a national scale. "Why me?" Marcus asked. "There must be other people with more education or formal credentials. There are people with more degrees," Colonel Mitchell agreed. "But you have something that can't be taught in a classroom: credibility with the population you're trying to serve. When you tell a homeless veteran that recovery is possible, they believe you because you've walked in their shoes. That's invaluable." The decision was not difficult. Marcus accepted the position, which would begin in 3 months after he completed training in Washington, D.C., and handed over leadership of the local program to Jake and 2 other veteran volunteers he had been mentoring. The training in D.C. was intensive but fascinating. Marcus worked alongside 9 other veterans from different parts of the country, all of whom had similar stories of personal recovery and community service. The group included a former Navy SEAL who ran a program in California, a female Army veteran who worked with homeless women in Texas, and a Marine who had established mobile outreach services in rural areas of North Carolina. During the training, Marcus had the opportunity to meet with senior officials from the Department of Veterans Affairs, including Assistant Secretary Patricia Carson, who oversaw homeless veteran programs nationally. Secretary Carson was a veteran herself, having served as an Army officer before entering public service. "Sergeant Thompson," she said during their meeting, "your work has attracted attention all the way up to the Secretary's level. We see peer outreach as a critical component of our strategy to end veteran homelessness, and you've proven that the model works." The conversation with Secretary Carson led to an unexpected invitation. The following month, there would be a White House ceremony honoring veterans who had made significant contributions to their communities. Marcus had been selected as one of 10 veterans to receive the President's Volunteer Service Award. The White House ceremony was unlike anything Marcus had ever experienced. He stood in the East Room alongside other honored veterans, their families, and senior government officials. The president spoke about the importance of veteran service and the obligation of the nation to care for those who had served in uniform. When Marcus's name was called, he stepped forward to receive his award. The president shook his hand and thanked him for his service, both military and civilian. But the moment that would stay with Marcus forever came after the official ceremony, during the reception that followed. He was talking with Sarah, who had accompanied him to Washington, when a tall figure in uniform approached. Marcus immediately recognized the 4 stars on the man's shoulders and came to attention despite being in civilian clothes. "Sergeant Thompson," the general said, extending his hand. "I'm General Michael Donovan, Chief of Staff of the Army. I wanted to personally thank you for what you're doing for our soldiers." Marcus shook the general's hand, still somewhat overwhelmed by the attention from such a high-ranking officer. "Thank you, sir. I'm just trying to take care of my fellow veterans." "That's exactly what makes you special," General Donovan replied. "In the Army, we talk about values like loyalty and selfless service. You're living those values every day, even though you're no longer wearing the uniform." The general paused, then did something that surprised everyone in the immediate vicinity. He came to attention and rendered a crisp salute to Marcus. "From one soldier to another," he said simply. Marcus returned the salute, fighting back tears. In that moment, he felt the full weight of how far he had traveled from the broken man sitting on a sidewalk with a cardboard sign. The homeless veteran that everyone had overlooked was being saluted by the highest-ranking officer in the United States Army. The ceremony and the recognition that followed marked a turning point in Marcus's work. The peer outreach program expanded rapidly, with new sites opening in cities across the country. Marcus spent much of his time traveling, training new coordinators, and helping local organizations adapt the model to their specific populations. Each city presented unique challenges. In Los Angeles, the sheer number of homeless veterans required a different approach than the more personal methods that had worked in smaller communities. In rural areas of Montana, veterans were scattered across vast distances, requiring mobile outreach services and creative use of technology. But the core principles remained the same everywhere: veteran helping veteran, building trust through shared experience, and never giving up on someone who was still struggling. Marcus insisted that every new program be led by veterans who had overcome their own challenges, because authenticity was the foundation of effective outreach. 2 years after the White House ceremony, Marcus received another unexpected phone call. This one was from General Henderson, the medical command general he had met at the Veterans Appreciation Ceremony that had started his rise to national prominence. "Marcus, I have a proposition for you," she said. "The Army is establishing a new position, Director of Veteran Transition Services. It would be a senior civilian position equivalent to a colonel's rank, with responsibility for developing programs to help soldiers transition successfully to civilian life. You'd be preventing the problems instead of just treating them after they develop." The offer represented another major step forward in Marcus's career and mission. Instead of helping veterans after they became homeless, he would be working to prevent homelessness by ensuring that soldiers leaving the military had better support and preparation for civilian life. Marcus accepted the position, which required him to relocate to Washington, D.C. Sarah, whom he had remarried in a quiet ceremony the previous year, was supportive of the move. Their relationship had been rebuilt on a foundation of honesty, mutual support, and shared commitment to his recovery and their future together. The new job was demanding but rewarding. Marcus worked with military commands around the world to develop transition programs that addressed not just job training and benefits, but mental health, family relationships, and the psychological aspects of leaving military service. He drew on his own experience and the stories of thousands of veterans he had worked with to create programs that were practical and effective. One of his proudest accomplishments was the development of a peer mentorship program that paired soldiers leaving the military with veterans who had successfully transitioned to civilian careers. The program significantly reduced the number of new veterans who experienced homelessness or serious adjustment problems. But Marcus never forgot his roots. He continued to volunteer with local outreach programs, and he made sure to spend time on the streets talking with homeless veterans whenever he was traveling to different cities. Those conversations kept him grounded and reminded him of why his work mattered. 5 years after receiving the President's Volunteer Service Award, Marcus was invited to speak at the commissioning ceremony for new officers at West Point. As he looked out at the young men and women who were beginning their military careers, he thought about the journey that had brought him to this moment. You are about to embark on a career of service that will challenge you, change you, and give your life meaning, he told the new officers. Some of you will face battles that go beyond the physical dangers of combat. You may struggle with invisible wounds, with the transition back to civilian life, or with finding your place in a world that doesn't always understand what you've experienced. Marcus paused, looking at their young, eager faces. When that happens, remember that seeking help is not a sign of weakness. It's a sign of courage. And remember that you are never alone. The same bonds that connect you to your fellow officers today will connect you to the veteran community for the rest of your life. After the ceremony, many of the new officers approached Marcus to thank him and ask questions about his work. One young lieutenant, recently graduated from West Point, seemed particularly interested. "Sir, how do you know when you've really made a difference?" she asked. Marcus thought about all the veterans he had helped over the years. Jake, who now ran his own successful construction business and volunteered with homeless veterans. David Martinez, who had completed his degree and become a counselor specializing in PTSD treatment. Hundreds of others who had found their way back to stability and purpose. "You know you've made a difference when someone who was lost finds their way home," he said finally. "And when they turn around and help someone else find their way home too. That's when you know the mission is working." As Marcus and Sarah drove back to Washington that evening, he reflected on the incredible journey that had taken him from homeless veteran to national leader in veteran services. The man who had once been invisible on a city sidewalk was now helping to shape policy at the highest levels of government. But the most important measure of his success was not the awards or the recognition or the prestigious job title. It was the knowledge that somewhere tonight, a homeless veteran was taking the first step toward recovery because someone cared enough to reach out. It was the understanding that the bonds of military service extended beyond active duty, creating a network of support that could catch anyone who was falling. The homeless veteran that everyone had overlooked had become impossible to overlook. But, more importantly, he had made sure that other veterans would not be overlooked either. The mission that had begun with a cup of coffee and a business card had grown into a national movement, proving that one person's recovery could become the foundation for healing an entire community. As they reached home, Marcus thought about the words he had spoken to the new officers. "You are never alone." It was a promise he intended to keep, not just for one veteran or one city, but for every former service member who needed to know that their sacrifice mattered and their struggles would not be faced in isolation. The general had saluted him, but Marcus knew the real honor belonged to every veteran who had found the courage to ask for help and every volunteer who had answered that call. Together, they had proven that no veteran had to be forgotten, overlooked, or left behind. The mission would continue, one connection at a time, until every veteran made it home.